So welcome to a dear friend, Deputy Secretary Sherman. You have been a longtime supporter and champion of USGLC literally since day one. So it's truly an honor to host you for our Global Impact Forum. So welcome.
Well, it's my honor, Liz. I think what USGLC does is just phenomenal. It helps Americans understand why national security and foreign policy has anything to do with their day-to-day lives. And you have built a cadre of supporters all across America. And it's really important because, as you know, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, Vice President Harris have talked about foreign policy for the middle class. And that's our focus, to make sure that what we do every day matters to the day-to-day lives of Americans.
Well, that's exactly what I want to talk to you about. We are kicking off this forum with the largest and most diverse audience ever. There's tens of thousands of leaders tuned in from across the country: business, faith, NGO leaders, veterans, diplomats, experts, and next-gen leaders that are all really tuned in because they understand what you just said, that what happens in the world matters at home. So I want to talk to you about the administration's vision for America's role in the world. Our conversation takes place as the president is on his first trip overseas. President Biden is attending some important global summits where he has said that this is an opportunity to demonstrate that democracies work as we contest the rise of autocracy. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, in your own nomination hearings, has said what you just talked about, that this is a foreign policy for the middle class, that we're going to show that foreign policy benefits the American people. So talk a little bit more about how this vision is shaping our approach to America's role in the world, or as USGLC often says, that why leading globally matters locally.
Well, look, I think the most immediate, of course, is fighting a pandemic, which cuts across borders. And in fact, nobody is safe until everyone is safe. And I think the president, Vice President Harris, had the right approach. Let's get Americans vaccinated. Now, 6 out of 10 Americans are vaccinated. Let's start getting our economy on the road. But then let's make sure we turn our focus to the world, because we've seen if variants, mutations happen in one country, they can be transported to our country. And we'll go through this process all over again. Maybe not as much death, but certainly even people vaccinated, perhaps getting sick. So we want to be very careful. We want to show leadership out in the world, that America, in fact, cares about what happens to people in the rest of the world. We do that because of our values of humanitarianism and making sure that everyone is safe. But we do it in our own self-interest to make sure that Americans stay safe and secure. I'd say the same is true of climate. The changes that are taking place in our climate. Out west right now, we're seeing a terrible drought, very excessive heat temperatures. We know glaciers are melting. We know things are changing. And we have to deal with climate all over the world. We just saw for the last few days the G7 leaders at the G7 summit making commitments around climate to move forward, and understanding that we all have to work together to make sure that our lives are safe. But even more than that, the jobs of the future are going to be climate friendly. They're going to really be high tech. We need to retool our economies to make sure that we have those high value jobs for American citizens going forward. So I could go on and on, but I think you get the general idea. We understand how the world is connected. We understand what we have to do to keep Americans safe and prosperous and free.
Let's go back, and I want to go back to the global pandemic that you mentioned. We, like you, agree we're not safe until everyone around the world is safe. And this was a significant announcement last week by the president when he said that the US will buy 500 million vaccine doses. It matters in terms of America leadership on the world stage, leveraging our allies to the development world. And as you just said, to our own recovery here at home. Yet you and I both know that this is not and cannot be the end of the global response. There's challenges with distribution and delivery, growing humanitarian challenges here. around the world. What do you see as the next steps in our global response to not only get the pandemic under control, but to prevent the next pandemic, should there be, and to make sure that we have the political will so this never happens again?
Well, I think part of that is the 100-day report that came out last week on supply chain resilience to make sure that we are prepared for the next pandemic or the next crisis or the next catastrophe, that the supplies we need, we either produce here at home, or one of our allies and partners produces it, or we have redundant systems so that there is resilience wherever and whenever there is a catastrophe. That report has detailed step-by-step plans of what we need to do to make sure we have that resilience. Everything from personal protective gear that we were very concerned about whether we had enough of, the precursor elements that go into making vaccines that we control, semiconductors that allow our cars to be manufactured because they're so dependent on those semiconductors for all the computer technology that we're going to need for the future. It is a superb report, and it talks about that resilience that we need at home and with our partners and allies to make sure that Americans are ready, that we are safe, and that we can prosper.
The impact of the pandemic is not only about health, so let's talk about the economy. Over the past year, global GDP has fallen by $5 trillion. Places like Latin America, South Asia have seen some of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Emerging economies hit hardest by the pandemic make up more than half of US exports. So while there's a lot to do here at home, global marketplaces are key to our own economy. So, from where you sit at the State Department, where do tools of economic statecraft, diplomacy, development, foreign assistance, USAID, the New Development Finance Corporation, fit into promoting economic development as part of our own economic recovery?
You've just made really critical comments, Liz. I was in Southeast Asia just a few days ago in Indonesia, in Cambodia, in Thailand, and I can tell you that they have a lot of recovery to do. They're still fighting the COVID pandemic in increasing numbers of cases in many countries around the world. And their ability to build back better is going to be even tougher. So everything from our Development Finance Corporation to more traditional US foreign assistance, which really assists us because it creates markets for our exports, are quite critical. We've got to use all the tools at our disposal to help countries build back better. And we saw again at the G7 a big discussion about what we need to do as the major industrial economies to help the rest of the world. And again, we help the rest of the world because our values say that we need to help people, but we help the rest of the world to create the markets for our exports, to create that resilience that I spoke of in supply chains, to make sure that American values, American competition, American leadership, to have the technology and the future that we all need for the next decade can happen. So it all is interconnected. It all impacts everybody. Every small business these days looks for export markets abroad. So we have to make sure that those markets are there for our small business as well as our major corporations, and to ensure that Americans have the jobs they need going into the future.
Every global challenge today leads to a conversation about China. And as Deputy Secretary of State, you've been charged to help manage this complex relationship. There's lots of parts of this conversation, but one of them I want to focus in on is many of us have been watching about China has tried to use their leverage of diplomacy and development. We've been watching and been talking quite a bit about how they have used their Belt Road Initiative, their aid throughout the developing world, which is 7 times that of the Marshall Plan, since the COVID breakout, China has said that they have provided vaccines and supplies to over 80 countries. So, as China's rise in the global stage, can you talk about how America needs to show up with our development and diplomacy tools to advance our interests and our values in the world as it relates to China, and what the stakes are if we don't get this right?
The stakes are extremely high if we don't get this right. China, the People's Republic of China, the PRC, under Xi Jinping has become much more aggressive in every domain in which we operate. And so the president, the secretary have said, we are going to compete with China and make an effort to win. And I believe we can. We are going to challenge China where we must, and we will cooperate and coordinate when it is in our interest to do so, such as climate, perhaps some arms control, even around global health, even though we're still waiting for further transparency on the origin of the COVID pandemic. But more to your point, the Chinese use their foreign assistance, use their vaccines in a transactional way. It comes with strings attached to it. The United States is supplying vaccines to countries who need it as those needs arise. So we will be giving that 500 million doses to at least 92 countries on top of the 80 million that we had already committed. And we are doing so largely through COVAX because we want to make sure that we're doing this for countries in need, not as a transactional approach. I think the United States, again at the G7 meetings, worked with others to say that we have to have our own alternative to Belt and Road. That alternative really helps developing countries build the climate, transparent, technology friendly jobs that are necessary for the future. In most of the Southern Hemisphere, the majority of the population is under the age of 35. Those young people are looking for the jobs of the future. If we don't help create those jobs, those middle class, those export markets for us, we're going to have greater conflict. We're going to have situations we're going to have to send our blood and treasure abroad. None of us wants to do that. So it is in our own self-interest to make sure that the whole world rises while we rise and are able to compete successfully with China. Challenge them where we must and cooperate where it's in our interest to do so.
I could ask questions to you and listen all day long. This is exceptional, but because of time, I'm going to end with one last question. Today, the USGLC is launching an education and engagement campaign with a rather simple, maybe a more complex question, but here it is. It's called What It's Worth. To ask the question, foreign aid, what it's worth. Global health, what's it worth? Diplomacy, what's it worth? For many of us, it's been about that first hug of a loved one after 15 months of battling a global pandemic. And that we make sure we use all these tools we've been talking about so it never happens again. And as you and I both know, the truth is there's so much more to the story as we've been talking about. So as one of our top diplomats in our nation, Madam Deputy Secretary, I'm going to ask you, diplomacy, what's it worth?
Diplomacy, as President Biden has said, is our tool of first resort. Diplomacy is worth our freedom, our prosperity, and our security. Sometimes that diplomacy works best with a credible threat of force, but our use of our military, of our men and women and the families who support them should be our last resort, not our first resort. Diplomats work really hard. They put their lives in danger all of the time. They work to make sure that Americans have the jobs for the future, a security for their families, and to make sure that our values around human rights, transparency, the rules-based order, and freedom are there for everyone throughout the world, first and foremost for Americans.
Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman, thank you for not only joining us today, but most of all for your service to our nation. It's a privilege to have you join us for this conversation.
Thank you, Liz, and thank USGLC for what it does to help Americans understand the value of what we do on behalf of Americans throughout the world, for your advocacy, for your education, and thank you and everyone who is part of this for the service you provide our country in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of domains. We thank you and are greatly appreciative. Have a great conference.